Good evening. I think we'll get started. My name is Chris Kiesling, and I'm the Elmer L. Andersen Director of Archives and Special Collections here at the University Libraries, and I'd like to welcome you here tonight for a very special program featuring Chris Cardozo. At the bottom of each of Chris Cardozo's outgoing emails is a quote from Edward S. Curtis that reads, "It's such a big dream, I can't see it all." Curtis, of course, was referring to his 20-volume magnum opus, The North American Indian, which was published between 1907 and 1930. In using this quote in his emails, Chris, I think, may be referring to his own magnum opus, the republication of The North American Indian, which is happening right now, right here in River City. So we're here tonight to celebrate this achievement and also the acquisition of the new North American Indian by the University of Minnesota Libraries Department of Archives and Special Collections. And some of you I know have seen over here, been looking at the initial volumes that we've received from Chris, and you're welcome to come and take a look at those. And then we have one volume of the original publication, so you can kind of see the difference between the two, or the similarities. Special Collections and Rare Books curator Tim Johnson and I have had the privilege of working closely with Chris and his colleagues at Cardozo Fine Art on various aspects of the project, including determining whether libraries that hold the original work would be interested in the republication. Yes. How much would they pay? A lot. Are 50 copies too many to publish? No. 75? No. Chris and his colleagues have sweated the details regarding appropriate binding materials, the perfect weight and texture of the paper, and the optimal resolution for digital scans of the images in producing these beautiful books. Chris Cardozo is a St. Paul native and majored in photography and film here at the university, graduating with his BFA in 1971 and his JD, which he doesn't talk about very much, in 1977. A fine art photographer in his own right, he is also the world's leading expert on Edward Curtis and a generous donor to the university libraries. If republishing the North American Indian wasn't enough, Chris is also spearheading a major celebration on the Northwest Coast and elsewhere in celebration of Curtis's 150th birthday in 2018. For our presentation this evening, Chris will be joined by his colleagues, Cardozo Fine Art Studio Manager Peter Bernardy, and Indulgence Press publisher and master printer Chip Schilling. Together they will discuss the motivations behind and the process of the republication project. And as you listen to Chris and Peter and Chip talk about various aspects of the project, you'll begin to understand that truly no detail went unnoticed. Please welcome Chris Cardozo.
Am I live? It sounds like it. Yes? You hear me? Wonderful. First of all, thank you all so much for coming. If I weren't speaking, I wouldn't have come tonight. It's so gorgeous out, and I don't think we'll have too many gorgeous nights like tonight for at least a few months. So thank you all for making the effort to come. I also feel particularly lucky. It was a very inauspicious beginning. I went to put on my pants, so if they had a stain on them, I was able to get most of it out. Then as I looked down the other leg, I noticed I'd gotten hand cream on that. I got most of that out. Then I went over to pick up my glasses that had just gotten fixed because I'd broken a lens off 2 weeks ago. The prescription is off, so I can kind of see most of you. So you're going to have to raise your hand really high if you have a question. And then as I was coming out of the glasses shop, I walked into something and got a big bunch of schmutz on the other leg. So in the old days, I would have gone, this is way too embarrassing, I'm going home. But anyway, I'm older and wiser, so here we all are. So again, thank you so much for coming. And Peter Bernardy, who Chris mentioned, who's not only my studio manager, but the master printer at Cardozo Fine Art, who's been with us for 18 years. And Peter has made fine art photographic prints that have gone to 40 countries, 100 different venues, major museums. And without Peter, we wouldn't be here. And without Chip, we certainly wouldn't be here with this project and the number of other projects that we've done over the years. So thank you all. So as Chris said, this is something I use on a lot of my emails. It's such a big dream, I can't see it all. And if I had to have one quote to sum up everything that Curtis did, this would be it, because it was such a big dream, and it just about killed him, bankrupted him, lost his family, but it was a huge, wonderful dream. And I wish I could say it was about me. I had no idea what I was getting into, so I didn't even have a dream. I just started working on it. So I'm going to very briefly, without the University of Minnesota, for me, none of this would have been possible without the University of Minnesota, where I started out 40-some years ago. According to my mother, none of this would be possible without her, but that's a whole other story. Speaking of which, Mrs. Bernardy is here from Fargo, and I think she gets the award, Peter's mother, who I think gets the award for coming the furthest distance to join us tonight. So, and actually I should also mention, Tim and Chris have been absolutely fabulous to work with for years. We're doing great things together. And actually, just to correct one thing, when I first came to Chris, I said, gee, do you think 10 copies? It was 10. And I think we're going to charge $500 a set. I mean, something totally crazy. And Chris and Tim have kind of coached us through this entire process as we've moved it along. We actually now have 30 subscribers, Harvard, Bancroft Library, UC Berkeley, some fabulous private collectors. And again, Tim and Chris have played really, really important roles in shepherding us through. So 40-some years ago, I was an undergraduate photography student at University of Minnesota, and a professor of mine, Alan Downs, who some of you may be familiar with, asked me to join him in Mexico. And I did. It took me 6 months to save up enough money to buy a 10-year-old Volkswagen Beetle. I ended up in Mexico. I ended up in this little village before I'd ever seen Curtis's work. I did 8,000 or 10,000 negatives. I did film footage. I collected material culture, and I did sound recordings of language and music. And within a day and a half of getting back from this incredible 6-month experience, where I saw 3 Caucasians, someone saw my sepia-colored work and said, you've got to see this book that just came out a couple months ago on this guy named Curtis. And seeing that book coming back from this amazing experience was one of the great watershed experiences in my life. And again, all tied to the University of Minnesota. Had I not been an undergraduate photography student here, had Alan Downs not been here teaching, had he not invited me to go to Mexico, by the way, to help make a film that after driving 75 hours and I found his little house in this little village, he said, oh, Chris, I should have written you. I decided not to make the film. So crazy coincidences, and I ended up in this village. So let's now talk about Curtis. So I've always felt that I was led to Curtis's work. The coincidences and serendipity were 100 million to 1 that this would have happened. So let's talk about Curtis. So after 42 years, and we'll talk just a little bit about Curtis to make sure you have a sense of him, and then we're going to talk a lot more about the republication project. After 42 years of working with Curtis's work, coming at it initially as a fine art photographer, I've come to appreciate the depth, profoundness, spirituality, sheer beauty of the work in its many facets. And so when I talk about Curtis's work, more and more I talk about the sacred legacy of beauty, heart, and spirit. And I talk about it as a legacy that was co-created, and this is a big change in the conversation over the last 20, 30 years. It's a legacy that was co-created by Edward Curtis and close to 10,000 Native people. There's such clear evidence and records of the Native people actively participating and co-creating with Curtis. And it's really a very different perspective, rather than thinking this was some white photographer who came into an indigenous village and appropriated their culture and their images. This was what they wanted preserved, and you listen to the sound recordings, you read the text, the incredible text that details their personal lives, their religion, their mythology, and you know that this was what the record they wanted left for their descendants and for the rest of the world. Scott Momaday is a Pulitzer Prize winning Native American who has written a great piece for one of my early books. And one of the reasons I like this quote so much, one, he talks a little bit more in this quote how he felt like he was experiencing a memory in his blood. He felt like he was home for the first time when he saw this image. He'd never seen this image before, and it turned out this was his tribal group, this image that he was seeing, that he discovered later. But again, it's that idea of the universality of this work, and to me, the Curtis work is a deeply human story. Yes, it is about Native Americans. Yes, it was created by Edward Curtis, but it is a profoundly human story that touches on dignity and pride and inclusion, vision, passion. So here are three faces of Edward Curtis. His classic field portrait in the center, and there are a couple very successful Hollywood producers are now working on a film about Curtis. They're actually going to be here in a week to meet and talk. And when I mentioned that to someone, the joke was just make sure they get the hat right. As that he loved hats, and that hat in the center was really his signature piece. He's in front of a baleen whale on the left, and that is Curtis 1 year before he died at age 84 in 1952. Teddy Roosevelt was a great champion of his, and Curtis had the backing of the world's wealthiest man, J.P. Morgan. The cast of characters beyond Chief Joseph and Red Cloud and Geronimo, and again approximately 10,000 other Native people, the cast of characters was amazing. J.P. Morgan, Teddy Roosevelt, the King of England, Carnegie's, Guggenheim, really incredible group, an incredible group of scholars. And Roosevelt was Curtis's greatest champion. Morgan was his greatest patron. And this is back to that idea of universality. This is probably Curtis's historically most important photograph. This was the summer of 1900. He was in Montana. He had gone with a very prominent ethnographer who had spent 20 seasons in the field with the Blackfeet and the Piegan. And this was the first time Curtis was with Native people who, because he was with George Bird Grinnell, were really willing to open up to him as human beings and talk about their religion, their mythology. And he photographed Native people on and off in the Puget Sound area for a few years, but it was somewhat distant, and he wasn't able to have a deep human connection with them. So this time he was with people who told him who they really were, what they really believed in, where they came from. He was witnessing one of the last great enactments of the Sundance ceremony. Like most ceremonies of the time had been outlawed by the U.S. government, which has now since been revived, in no small part because of the records that Curtis has left. But this was the watershed experience in his life, and very, very important print. And this is actually, as a collector, one of the great thrills for me, because this is negative number 52 in the year of 1900. We know it's this critical period, and this was done with a process that Curtis used that he only did for a year or two. So from a collector standpoint, very, very fun. And I'm going to quickly go through some images, and then we're going to talk about the republication project. Great platinum photograph of Geronimo, a Hopi chief. This is a print that Curtis made in the field. Again, as a collector, these are the kinds of things I love, because I can hold that print in my hand and know that Curtis held it in his hand, and this print was made within a day or two of the day the negative was made. And this was that same field trip in 1900 to Montana as the three chiefs were. So Curtis did the cyanotypes in the field immediately to get some feedback on his negatives. The next step was to go back into a studio in Seattle and make very simple black and white prints, as I'm sure most of you have noticed. Everything Curtis does is sepia, basically. So you find these, and we know these were not intended for exhibition. They were merely for reference to give them a further idea of what his negative was like. And I should mention, we'll obviously get into it in a minute. Well, one other thing I should mention is Curtis grew up in Minnesota. Another nice Minnesota connection. From age 5 or 6 until age 18, he lived near Le Sueur in a little town called Cordova, and then moved out to the Puget Sound area when he was about 18. This is a border print. Curtis created this border in the studio. And very few of his images, we believe he made somewhere between 40 and 50,000 negatives during this project, most of them on glass plates, ranging from 6 by 8 inches to 14 by 17 inches. And this was one that he would do. I've never found a record of these being sold, but I know that he would give them to people, patrons, prospective subscribers. These would be gifted to them. And these comprise about maybe 1 in 1,000 of the prints that he made and survived. This is the great Dakota chief, Red Cloud. Very compelling portrait. Most of the images we see of Curtis's work were things that were published in the North American Indian, the 20 volumes, 20 portfolios, 2,234 prints and 2,438,207 words, Chip, more or less. Anyway, this is a photograph that is not found in the North American Indian. Again, as a collector, this is the kind of thing that I get really excited about. I found this at auction 15 years ago and loved it, and I've since found one reproduction of it in a 1905 Scribner's magazine. So I bought it, I loved it, I had it as part of my collection, and about 10 years later, I was back in New York at an auction, and this came up, and there was another print I was really interested in that came up the day before this, and I was outbid by someone who was clearly a major hedge fund guy, and there was no way I was going to compete with this guy at an auction. And I assumed he'd be there the next day to bid on this, and he didn't show up, and I put my hand up, and I spent a lot of time thinking, what's the maximum I can really spend on this, because I really, really want this. I didn't get the other one, and I was still sweating it, and I'd be making notes in my catalog, and I'd change the price. I can go to this much, no, I can go to that much. And the first bid, I put my paddle up, and that was it. There wasn't another bid, and I literally, the only time in my life in auction, I literally turned around to see where was everyone. Anyway, I got this, and I was so excited to get it, and I shipped it back home, and I was telling my assistant at the time how excited I was, and she said, well, Chris, you know that you have another photograph of the same man, right? I said, I do? So again, a great thrill to have this and realize this was taken 2 negatives. We can track the negative numbers. This was taken the same day and 2 negatives away from the previous one. So I'm going to go through very quickly now so we can talk about the republication. I'm just giving you a sense of the breadth and depth of Curtis's work. This is the photograph that Scott Momaday bought, that brought tears to his eyes and made him feel like he had discovered a memory in his blood. This is horse capture, and both his grandson and great-grandson have contributed to books of mine, Joe and George Horse Capture. The great image from that same summer of 1900, the Piegan encampment. And then besides doing the books and other things that we've been up to, and as I was saying, with Peter's help, sending exhibitions to every continent but Antarctica, we do exhibitions that we've also done, a few in the United States. They've mainly been out of the United States, but we did one at the Minneapolis Public Library at the Cargill Gallery about 3 years ago, and we had a guest book. We normally don't see the guest books because these things are in Finland or Papua New Guinea or wherever, but this time we got a copy of the guest book, and this one page is still one of the big thrills of my life. I was reading through, and there were wonderful notes from people from Russia, from Australia, which I was really surprised so many people ended up at the Minneapolis Public Library. And we were told more people had come to the library to see that exhibition than any in history, or people had come back to the library. So it was all a great thrill, but the biggest thrill for me was opening up to this page. Yeah. And that's a big part of what we're doing these days. Besides the republication project, we're working on a 10,000 print repatriation project to Native people. We are working on re-identifying all the people in Curtis photographs, so we have about 3,000 unidentified individuals, and through social media and other things we're doing, we are hoping to reunite the names of all these individuals with their photographs. So, here's what Curtis did. This was Curtis's big dream, to create this fabulous set of rare books. 20 volumes, 20 portfolios, 2,200 plus prints, over 2.5 million words. And it took me 25 years of collecting and buying and selling before I was able to get my first one, and it was a great thrill, and I love having it. And about 2 years ago, Pete, with Sanders, is it 2 years ago, more or less? 2.5? Keith, you did it about 2.5 years ago with Sanders. So a client of ours called out, oh, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. This, if you wanted to see what the Curtis books look like until a couple years ago when we got mixed up in this crazy business, the only thing that was available is what you're seeing on the left. It was a very inexpensive reprint done in the early 1970s by a company called Johnson Reprint that primarily reprinted text volumes. They did not deal with visual imagery much, and they reprinted the entire set, quite small, as you can see on the left, and in a very cheap black and white printing, which to me, as I've said, really destroys the whole thing. If you don't have the sepia, if you don't have those earth tones, you aren't getting any sense of what Curtis was really trying to communicate. So that was all that was available until 2 years ago. Here's another scale. So you're seeing our current republication project on your right and the Johnson reprint on the left. About 2 years ago, a client called up and he had bought a couple of my books, and he said, I've got a volume 1 and an 8-year-old grandson, and he really has gotten interested in it, but I don't want him handling the volume 1. I don't want to have to be supervising him. I don't want him to accidentally tear something and feel horrible. Could you make me a replica of the volume 1? And as I often do without thinking about it, I said, sure. And this time I got lucky because Keith, who's in the back corner, who works with Peter, and Peter, we had everything that we'd scanned the entire set. We had commissioned someone to scan the entire set about 25 years ago to create a CD-ROM. And I think at that point doing half a megabyte files? What they are, Pete?
Oh, megabyte and a half.
Megabyte and a half. Whereas we're now doing 50, 100, big, we're doing big files. They were doing little files. So all we had to work with were these little files. So Keith happily jumped in and reprinted from those files, and they looked pretty good. And we took it up to Kinko's and had it spiral bound and printed a facsimile cover. And the client was happy, we were happy, and that was kind of fun. Another client, a year later, called and said, I've got a volume 4. We did that. And I'm starting to think, well, this is sort of interesting. There are a lot of people who would love to have it. And I researched the ugly Johnson reprint and found out they were selling for $8,000 to $13,000 a set when you could find them. So I'm thinking, okay, there's obviously a market out there. And we decided to jump in. And we had no idea what we were getting into. The first couple just seemed so easy. And the big decision point, which Chip will tell you much more about, was the text. And as Chris was mentioning earlier, we have put we thought it would be a 1-year, 10,000-hour project to create 85 sets of these books. It's turning into a 3 to 3.5 year, 35 to 40,000 hour project. once we decided how to really do things and to keep things at the quality level that we felt comfortable with and that Chris and Tim insisted upon. So this is what our sets will look like when they're completed. We're about 40% of the way through. And again, we welcome you to come take a look at the originals over on the table. And one of the things that we tried to do as we work through is the big decision point, and actually let me jump ahead for a second. The really big decision point for me, and this turned out to be one of those things that has had such incredible consequences and ramifications that at the time I had no idea. We had to decide, were we going to scan the original text, which is what you're seeing enlarged a number of times on the left, that was letterpress printed, very beautiful, very charming, but not always the easiest to read, especially in the index and the appendix. Whether we were going to just reprint it like that, which would have been pretty straightforward, or whether we were going to scan all 2.5 million words, special characters, many of which do not exist in the English language or any typography that exists, language and music. And after a fairly brief discussion, we just decided the one on the right was so beautiful that there was really no option. Again, not quite knowing what we were getting ourselves into, which Chip is going to tell you a lot more about in just a minute. So there's our book. This is from volume 3, which contains a beautiful map. There are many color photographs in the books, which I assume Peter might show you an example or two of. Well, maybe, maybe not. The jury's still out on that. As I was mentioning, Curtis Reaper, he did 10,000 wax cylinder recordings of language and music, which are transcribed in the books. Back to the text. And that is basically my introduction, because Peter and Chip know a lot more about this than I do, so I'm going to turn the floor over to the experts. I'll come back up and we'll have a Q&A when we're done. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, a lot of people. Thank you all for coming tonight. If I suddenly stop talking and become unresponsive, I've just realized that I'm in front of a bunch of people talking, so bear with me a little bit.
You might need to get closer to the back.
Oh, sure.
And he did have a color photograph every time.
Oh, yeah, there it is. These are actually, there's not too many of these, of the hand-colored images, and they're actually one of the harder, in the set, they're one of the hardest ones for us to reproduce. The way we're printing them. I wanted to first touch on Chris mentioned this at the beginning of his talk, just touch on our experience with printing Curtis images. Over the years, we've done numerous projects where we're printing his images in lots of different photographic processes and lots of different formats. And that experience really informed how we approached this project, and it also made the idea of reproducing or printing 2,200 plus images a little more, well, it was a little easier to think about doing that based on all the experience we've had printing his images. I'm going to talk briefly about some of the steps that were required to get us to this point. There's a couple pictures of the images in the volume, and I'm primarily responsible for creating the images in these volumes, and Chip, as Chris mentioned, is primarily responsible for doing the text. So we wanted to start with, be able to start with the best digital files possible, and that we could reasonably create with the source material we had. And luckily we had access to a complete set in really great condition, and so we were able to use that to create the digital files that we needed for the project. We started with the portfolio photogravures, which are the large oversized prints, and those are relatively easy to deal with. They're flat, they're easily positioned. We set up a kind of a basic copy stand set up to capture those. This is Brad Miller. He captured all the 700 plus photographers for the project. The volume images were a little different because we didn't have access to all the individual prints in the volumes unbound, and so we had to figure out a way to photograph the prints in the volumes. And it was a little challenging. You can see we couldn't just lie the volume flat on a table and photograph them because of the binding and the curvature of the pages. So we decided to create your typical book cradle, conservation book cradle, that would safely cradle the book. And then, after that, we created an easel of sorts. It's this black object that you're seeing here that would be positioned over the book, and then the pages could be raised and held in position in a flat plane, so we could photograph them more easily. And this was a much more complicated setup, but it ended up giving us really great results. This is Ralph Berlovitz, who photographed most of the volume photographers, and he's involved in a number of other areas of the project. After all the captures were done, 2,200 plus images, we imported them into an Adobe program called Lightroom, and that really made it easy for us to organize and do cropping on the images, do some processing, and then from there they were exported, and we actually did a little more work to them in another Adobe program called Photoshop, and we did some more cropping, fine-tuned the cropping, and also did some retouching and some more layer work. This is a great example of early on in the project of how we were proofing the images. And so this would have been a first round of proofing, just printing all the images in one volume and going through each one and deciding what kind of tonal adjustments that we would need to make. And whenever we're doing this, whenever we're printing Curtis images, we're always kind of informed by his aesthetic, and so we always use his aesthetic as a guide for how we're printing his images. It's a great example of how much imagery is involved in the project. And I currently don't do it this way anymore because it's just a little overwhelming to do it in this fashion. In addition to the images, to proofing the images, each image also has text that accompanies it, title, and some other text in the top and bottom margin. So in addition to the images, we're also having to proof all the text, and that's actually has ended up being much more tedious and time-consuming than working with the images. The way we proof the text is we take our prints, our contemporary prints, and then reference our original captures. So we're looking at the titling on the original photogravure and comparing that to our print and making notes about any spellings or any areas where ligatures or accents are in the wrong spot. And we have to do this at least five rounds of this in order to really get everything correct for each volume. That's Ralph Berlovitz again doing proofing. Another really important member of our team is Margaret Buchanan, who also is our lead proofreader. And once the prints any corrections that need to be made would be noted on the print, and then we hand those off to Keith Posell, who is in charge of making corrections. So Keith is really the main part of the project he's involved with is creating all the press sheets that we're printing to create all the images. So he places all the images and sets all the text for every image in the set, and then through various rounds he's making corrections that either Ralph or Margaret is seeing. This is the current state of our proofing table. You can get an idea of, round after round of proofing, how many prints and sets of prints that we need to create in order to get in order to be perfect, right? This is another view of our tower of proofs. And all these are is a great resource for our archive. All this stuff is being archived, so you can look back and really get a sense of the work involved in the project. Once the volume has been approved for printing and production, it moves into that stage. This is what you're seeing here is a registration sheet. We created this to make sure so that we could test whether or not the printers were placing the page. Well, we're running the pages through the printers and placing the pages in the same spot. So we're getting good registration through a number of all the other printers that we use. We're currently using 4 printers, and if a page is off registration, then that affects when it gets cut down into individual pages. So we run a single page through each printer, and we're just looking for variations in the printers, and if there's a large variation, we'll correct for that with printing guides on the printer. Here's a couple views of the prints coming out of our printers. Through each stage of the project, let me go back to that. Through each stage, we're always checking and rechecking, doing quality control. So that happens in the proofing stage, and then it also happens once we're in production too, just so we're not missing anything that may need to be corrected. At this stage, if we need to, we'll go back and make that correction. And that's Ralph Rulevitz again, and then here's our other production assistant, Taylor Gazelle. Here you can see a stack of printed press sheets, and we place each sheet between cotton blotters in order to promote the dryness and also to really get a flat sheet so that it'll be nice and flat when they get bound into the books. And this is another stage where they get checked again coming out of the blotters, and from there they head over to Campbell Logan and Allison Coward's team, which cuts up the sheets and collates them into the text, and where they get bound and all that stuff that I don't know about. Back to the text, we realized early on that the portfolio photogravures, the larger prints, have a really unique type font style. That were each title of the photogravures were hand cut into the copper plates, and it's this really unique font. And we realized that we weren't going to find a font that really looked anything like that. So we decided we would actually have to create that font in order to really be faithful to the original photogravures. And so Keith Posel took on that challenge, and as you can see in that image, it's not just the letters he's creating. It's also any accents and ligatures that are found on a lot of the images. And that actually took quite a while to do. And he used the original, here's an example. So the top is our created font, the font that Keith created, and the bottom is from an original photogravure. And then I'll just leave you with some numbers I just calculated the other day that give you an idea of the enormity of the project. That I was shocked by some of the numbers. And Chip is up next. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. Thanks, Peter. So I'll be talking about the text on this and some of the decisions we made and why we made those decisions. I was told to keep it to 7 minutes, so I don't have a whole lot of slides, but that's going to be fine. And I've never done a keynote, so I think I just touched that. And so this is about where we started. The page on the left is one of the original title pages, and the page on the right is from the VII file that was a digital conversion done sometime in the 1980s, I think, that Chris commissioned. And when I was brought into this to consult on this project, I was shown the VII files and as something to work from. And it's the title page. It's fairly close. It looks pretty good. One of the things you'll notice when you get into some of the text on the left again is an original text, and the text on the right is from the VII files. And quickly I noticed that the VII files really weren't going to work for us. I mean, the drop cap on the T is something that can easily be done, but in the VII files, if you look at a word like this name here, it's got all the special characters and Indian phonetic characters in it, and the VII files have none of that. Plus, the whole paragraph needed to be fully justified, and they dropped it short. We were able to contact them. The company is still in business, and they're in Colorado, and we were hoping that they still had the digital files that we could work from. And one of the guys that actually worked on this back in the 1980s recalled the situation, and he said, you know, he just laughed on the phone at me. He said, you know, it was such an enormous amount of work just to get this far that they eventually dropped. They only ended up scanning the original text, and the text also has at the end of it appendix and vocabularies and indexes that is full of these Indian phonetic characters, and it was way too much work and too difficult for that time period in the 1980s for what the OCR was capable of at that point in time. So that was dropped, and nothing was done with it since then. It had been, you know, originally the text was letterpress printed, which means it was printed from metal type. It was cast into metal, and one of the things that occurred to me, being a letterpress printer, is that, well, where did these special characters come from? Because they did not exist, as far as I knew, in metal type. And so it was kind of a mystery to me. Did someone cast that type? Did they carve the punches and actually make that type? And if so, does it exist somewhere? And so that's one of the things, the mysteries that I didn't know as I went through this project. But I quickly realized that the VII files weren't going to work. And so as Chris showed in that slide earlier of the original script and then the digitally typeset script, you know, one of the things a lot of people don't understand, you know, type is not just type. The original files, the original pages were printed from, like I said, metal characters. But digital type is not that. Digital type is something that is, you know, it doesn't exist in physical form. And it's a digital file made up of numbers. And in order to get the really sharp, crisp outline type, it's done, it's a vectored typeface, so it can draw those nice, perfectly curved lines. And it's visually, I mean, what we were after in terms of the text is the most legible and readable text, reader-friendly text that we could produce. I mean, certainly we could have just rescanned the original pages and done a really fancy facsimile of the original, but we wanted to make it more user-friendly, more legible, and also available digitally so it could be searched as an online archive of sorts. And so what we have here is now the original title page on the left and the newly set title page on the right. Again, pretty straightforward. You start to notice more of the differences when you get into more of the reading of the text. So again, an example of an original, what we've done with it. The digital type, because I mean, with anything that is you know, originally letterpress printed, each time it's scanned and reproduced, it's another generation away from the original. And because it was letterpress, it was ink on paper pressed physically into the paper, so there's ink spread and ink gain, and that's why you get a lot of the you know, counters and characters filling in some cases if they're over inked or if the paper was too rough or whatnot. And with digital type, you don't have any of that. You get what you print, and you get perfect reproduction. So one of the things that's interesting about working on the type on this project is the fact that you know, it's one thing to work with a text when you're flowing it into onto a page and you're creating original text that way. In this case, we are working with text that we're flowing onto a page, but we're trying to match an original and something that was letterpress printed, and it doesn't always, you know, I mean, I quickly realized that the typeface used in the original books was Caslon, which is historically important and a popular letterpress typeface. And there are a dozen digital versions of Caslon, all slightly different. And what we end up doing is that actually there's an amalgamation of 2 or 3 different Caslon typefaces in what we're using to match the original as close as possible. And line for line and word for word, and for the most case, I mean, after I print these out, let me just continue on here. On the upper left we have Dan Sheridan, who's doing the major OCR conversion, so he's taking the original scans of the original pages, running it through Adobe Acrobat optical character recognition program, and that converts it digitally to type. And then from there, it's formatted into, from on his side, about 80% of the as close to the original text as possible. I'll get into a little bit of the problems of that later, shortly later, but for the most part, you see down here an original page. It's formatted to match the original as closely as possible. I then put that on a light table and match it line for line, so that we're mimicking that original page as closely as possible. Lower light, on the lower right, everything's done on the computer. I use Adobe Acrobat. We use Adobe Photoshop for certain things, but all the type is set in Adobe InDesign. Once the files and the complete volume is set, it goes off to the printer when we're using Bookmobile to print these volumes. And one of the things that we're doing is, so the pages in the upper right there are returned Bookmobile proof files, and the text is what we're concerned with. I also have them print out low-res black and white image for the photographs. We're not using those. They allow us to take what Peter's producing as the really fine quality digital prints, and these are for placement, so we know where to put the original so we don't get them mixed in the wrong spot. So, as I'll move on. I just want to talk about some more of the reasons why resetting the type of this was another important thing. The page on the left is an original, and one of the things that given the text that was there, there's just a couple of typographic things that just are not appropriate in this day and age. And one of them is something that is called visual rivers, and that's this kind of area right there. They're very distracting to the eye, and it's not great typographic form. I'm sure there were a lot of limitations to what Curtis and his crew were doing at the time, and that was acceptable. And then also from what was standard in that day and age in the early 1900s was double spacing after a period. That's something that's pretty standard for typewriter set type. This monospace type. It's something that carried into the keyboarding of text for casting of type, but it's not something that is done today. And so we decided to, we're matching the originals as close as possible, but we're also bringing it to contemporary standards of legibility and reader friendliness. One of the things that we decided to do was the text is typeset digitally, but we're using the original scores of music. We could have reset music so it was as crisp and clear as a digital music staffs and measures could be, but it really would have lost an essence to the original volume. So Peter photographed all of the music scores. We went in and took out some of the some certain staff. Like the PPs here and some of the wording, and that is set digitally just for clarity. But all the music staffs in the middle, we kept the original, cleaned it up a little bit in Photoshop, but we wanted to keep some of that purity of the original and just the energy of the original music scores. So some of the other issues that have been kind of fun to deal with, there's appendix and and vocabulary is in the back, and there's a lot of column work, and there's different translations from the different tribes in certain words and languages. And this is just kind of an example of that. And you can see all these special characters that run throughout that. So, and what is that? Those special characters are all, they're Indian phonetic language. And that's what the optical character recognition programs cannot read. It can read anything that's standard English or various languages, but that was never translated, so it can't read it. And so this is just an example of what that is. And it's one of the most fascinating things about these volumes, is that it does have this translation and these original. So how do we deal with that? Here's the original page that was run through the OCR. At first we set up with Dan and we were doing this and we were like, oh my gosh, this is just really taking too long. I mean, in some cases it was 200 hours of volume. And we were like, well, there's got to be a better way to do this, and maybe we just don't know what it is. And through Chris's connections with A.D. Coleman, the photo critic, he directed us to a company in India. And we worked with Satish in India to try and find another source for doing the OCR. And their method of doing it was very different. And that's a page that comes back on the right. In some ways, some things were easier, but the reformatting of it just took so much extra time that it didn't actually pay off. And you can see that when it, some of these special characters, it's telling you what it is, a dot under a U, which is kind of funny. In some ways, it was easier to do a find and replace for that phrase, and then go in and put that in. But at the same time, it was just as easy to do it this way. And the page on the left here is when Dan does the OCR, it can't understand those characters, so it just guesses at what they are. It puts it in as letters of 1 or HL or capital R. And RI often becomes an M. So you really the proofreading became really important in this process. The page, so this is the roughed in OCR work that is at about 80%, and then the page on the right is final corrected versions. So what it means is we're going through this word by word, letter by letter in some cases, and digitally hand setting type, which is kind of funny. Being a letterpress printer, I'm used to hand setting individual letters of physical type, and now I'm doing it on a computer, and it's kind of funny to me in a way. But so what it means is that in the end, we're imperfect, and so it just means a whole lot of proofreading. And Peter mentioned earlier, Margaret Buchanan's the main proofreader on this project, and I am amazed at what she can find. In some cases, we're going through 5 or 6 versions of proofreading. Ralph, who's also here, does some of the proofing as well. It's kind of a thankless job. But Margaret, I mean, she can see the difference in 7-point type and 8-point type, and I'm like, wow, that's pretty amazing. So there's a lot of back and forth with the proofreading, and once everything is 100%, it goes off to Bookmobile. Bookmobile is a digital printing service in Minneapolis. They're over, I guess, in St. Louis Park, and they have been wonderful to work with. They have a particular digital printer that's called an OCE printer, and it lays down a matte colored ink, and it's archival, and it's perfectly registered printed page. Unlike a lot of digital printing, which has a gloss to it or is not permanent, doesn't transfers onto the page next to it. This is not, and this really sold us on this printing. And so behind you can see some of the crew there at Bookmobile. We upload the files digitally to them. They print them out. After they're done printing, they ship them to Campbell Logan. Campbell Logan Bindery, if you don't know that, is a small hand bindery here in Minneapolis. They're in the warehouse district still. It's a family-owned operation by Greg Campbell and his son now, Duncan Campbell. And they are renting a space on the 3rd floor for the production of this, the volumes. So the text arrives at Campbell Logan. Peter sends the prints over there. They get cut up on this guillotine print cutter here. You see various stages in the back. The original volumes had tissue paper interleaved over the original gravures. Although we're not dealing with original gravures, we want to keep that same essence and feel, so we're putting in the tissue over the top. And so in the upper right-hand corner, we have Allison Coward. She's the main production manager at Campbell Logan. She's here tonight. And she manages Joey and Darren Beneshi and in the production going on there. Joey and Darren Beneshi, what you're seeing here is Joey in the upper left is collating the portfolio prints. Something that actually wasn't mentioned. The original volumes had portfolios that had oversized large portfolios that had loose prints. The Johnson reprint did the portfolios in terms of bound books, and they had 5 volumes of portfolio prints in it in a much more reduced size. And there was an economy to that we really liked, and we found it was really important that we actually mimic. That's the one thing we took from the Johnson reprint that is actually a benefit to this project. The portfolios were binding 4 volumes at a piece, and you can see the bound portfolio over there. But they still have to be interspersed with the tissue. So that's what Joey's doing up there. She's interspersing tissue with the images for one of the portfolios. Darren and Beneshi are a young Ojibwe couple that work for us, and they are tipping in the tissue over the prints. And originally, these books were, they were all single sheets. They weren't, for anybody who know a little bit about books, they weren't bound in signatures. They weren't folded sheets. They were all individual sheets. And that's primarily, I think, because of the gravures. The gravures had to be run through a different kind of press and be done as individual prints anyway. So they printed the original text pages as single prints. So we are doing the same, and then they were being bound similarly to the originals. And so the tipping in of these tissue sheets, get tipped on the foredge in the area that's covered in by the sewing of the books. So anyway, there's Campbell Logan. As we move on, after they're sewn, after they're collated and checked, then they go down to the 2nd floor at the bindery. You see Duncan Campbell in the upper right sewing together one of the books. After the text block's sewn, they get packed up and shipped off to Beloit, Wisconsin, where the top edge is gilded with gold. This is the best example I have of it, although it's a finished bound book. But when they gild them, they're just the text blocks. After they come back from the gilders, they come back to Campbell Logan, and they get fully cased into their bindings. And here is, and I can't remember her name, Anna Laura. Anna Laura, you can see Anna Laura doing some the gold foil stamping of the spines for the books, and then the finished set of books there. And then once they're fully bound, they go back upstairs, and all throughout the stages, when they come back from the gilders, when they come back from downstairs, they get checked and rechecked and double checked, and so everything is perfect, and then we end up with a full set of books. So, yeah. So I think at this point, are you speaking again? Is there more?
I'll come up for a second, and then we'll all do Q&A.
Okay.
Thanks, Chuck.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I don't know about anyone else, but I'm impressed. Wow. As I said, Chip and Peter are the detail guys along with the rest of the gang, and we have lots of meetings, and I have a sense of it. This was really fun tonight. I turned over to Peter and I said, what a shame we aren't recording this. I'm learning things tonight. He said, oh, we are. So thank you, Chris and Tim, again for having us covered. So, a couple different things. Just acknowledge all the gang who's here. You've seen a lot of the people who we've gotten involved with, in both as employees and independent contractors and vendors. And just so you all know, again, Keith is back there. Sarah French, who's been with us for five months, and as I said, jumped into a very fast-moving stream and has been adapting. Ralph. Charlotte Lipa, who has just come on board and has jumped into kind of a raging torrent with all the different things we have going on. Allison, who's back here. And of course, you just met Peter and Chip. And I think that's it for the gang who's here. The other thing is I was watching this and thinking about it. My professional life had become very simple over the last few years, and we were down to 3 employees, and we'd create an exhibition here or there, or send an exhibition out another place, and things were pretty simple. And then we got involved in this project, and the next thing I knew, we have 4 locations, 11 employees, I don't know how many independent contractors, and the business has literally quintupled in its complexity. But it has been so great to be working with all these different people. And I mentioned, well, a couple things I mentioned very frequently is for me to be 67 years old and to be in the most exciting and creative time in my entire 45-year career is really a gift. And then to be involved in a project like this that involves so much collaboration. And again, as I mentioned earlier, Tim and Chris, all the help they've given us. Seattle Public Library has gotten very involved in helping us. Harvard has recently joined us as a subscriber, and everybody's cooperating and doing different things, and we're creating things I never would have imagined. So it has just been great. So I think we'll answer some questions. Again, thank you all so much for coming tonight, and thank you for your patience, and let's answer a few questions, and then we'll go get some food. Peter, Chip, you want to come? Yes. How did I become interested in Curtis? It really was because of that experience in that Indian village. I mean, I was an innocent middle-class kid from St. Paul, Minnesota, who went to a boys' military school and didn't know much about anything. And the next thing I knew, I'm living in a village by myself. I was held at gunpoint, knife point. I lost 25 or 30 pounds each of the 3-month periods I was there because I couldn't eat food because of the hepatitis, rampant hepatitis. It was an amazing experience, and I did those sepia-colored photographs, and literally within a day and a half of driving back to the United States, someone saw my photographs and showed me the book on Curtis. And a day after that, I went to Boulder and was visiting a childhood friend of mine from St. Paul who was living in Boulder, showed him the book, and he said, I know the people who found the whole archive. And at that point, I had $13 to my name, my 10-year-old Volkswagen Beetle, and I'd done the trade route of Minneapolis to Boulder many, many times because of girlfriends, sisters. I was going to school in Denver. I knew it was $11 gas money from Minneapolis. So I had my gas money and $2 to eat on for the next day and a half. And the friend took me into this little gallery to have the Curtis prints. And it was just this amazing, life-altering experience. And I did have an American Express card my father had gotten me for emergencies only. And this may be a precursor to going through law school, but it took me 2 hours, but I finally found a way to reconceptualize of buying 2 Curtis prints as an emergency. So I used the credit card, went into debt for the first time in my life, and here we are all tonight. Other questions? Todd? Come on. Oh, that's a good question. We actually had a great meeting this morning. 5 months ago, I would have said never. And I think we will be completely finished with the pre-publication, all the text, all that work within 6 to 8 months. And we will be done with production, Allison, year and a half. Somewhere year and a half. Yeah. Yes, Todd. Thank you.
How much will the fine cost?
the plant. We started out at $10,000. We're now up at $23,500 for a set as we've continued to improve and invest more. And I've been told by some book dealers and other people that they will probably top out at about $30,000 to $35,000 a set as we get further into the edition. Yes.
That exhibit at the Minneapolis Public Library, there were some prints that were just absolutely striking, but they're not the size of the original. How did you make them so startlingly sharp and brilliant? It's just
Peter?
Well,
I think you're talking about the big mammoth
yeah,
prints.
oh, yeah.
I thought I was talking about the gold tones maybe.
Also.
Yeah, the large prints. Well, again, because of the great source material we have in Chris's archive, we were able to do captures of original photogravures, not related to this project, but just separately. We would do high quality captures of really significant images from the collection, and those were printed. So using a really great digital file and some paper that I don't remember how we ended up coming across that paper, but it's not a typical inkjet paper. It's a paper made for watercolorists, and they make it in these huge sizes, and so those are kind of a recent addition to all the prints that we do, and they've become really favorite prints just because they're so large and striking.
And the other aspect of what Peter is talking about, and thank you for the question, is that's I think a very important part of what we're doing as a business these days, and what we're, I think, really doing with the republication project. I talk about it as both republishing and recreating what Curtis did, because as Chip pointed out so well, we are making subtle changes. We're trying to stay very true to the essence of what Curtis did and the spirit of what Curtis did, but we're finding ways to make things more accessible and more readable, more legible. And with the photographic prints, it's been one of the things that's been really enjoyable for me, and we've dealt with this now for 15 years. Initially, we tried to do everything that we were doing to look exactly like what Curtis did. And I've come to realize there are certain limitations because he had a variety of limitations, financial, material limitations, technological limitations. So both with those prints, but also what we're doing at the books, what Peter and I did, and Peter and I have been mastering prints together for 18 years, yeah? And Peter is fabulous at researching and finding different papers and doing different iterations. And he and I will get together and we'll go, well, this one works, this one doesn't work. This could be lighter, this could be more open. So with the books, what we're really trying to do is take the look and the feel of the original photogravures, which is a one-pass, single ink process. So they're beautiful, but it takes a fairly sophisticated eye to really appreciate them, and they are monochromatic, versus Curtis's beautiful exhibition platinum prints that have a much broader range. So what we tried to do in our recreation, our republication, is to find the best of the platinum prints and the photogravures and combine them into something. And what I could never argue with the beauty of Curtis's original photogravures, but what we're hearing over and over and over again from people is that what Peter's creating now is much more accessible, and for all but a pretty sophisticated group of viewers, even more beautiful. Yeah.
Modern cameras and all of that, the digital world has gotten better and better. And I'm wondering if your digital capture gear is now better than the original camera lenses that shot those images. How's that translating into this final output?
Pete, do you want to jump in?
Well, yeah, that's the lenses are certainly better. So Curtis in his day was shooting up to negatives up to 14 by 17 inches in size, and even back in the technology that they had back then, that there's a ton of resolution in those negatives. And I couldn't argue that the digital world has come close to that yet. They're getting there, but you know, something to capture that much resolution in the digital world, you need a really big sensor and a lot of money. But what the digital world, what we've been able to do in the digital world, in using Chris's source material to start with, and then using digital processes and captures, has worked really well. I mean, the photogravures especially are really conducive to capturing, you know, as much details as are in the photogravures as we can get out of the digital files. So there is definitely an advantage to digital, but there's certainly a trade-off also.
And the other thing I would say is that the other thing that I'd say is that really what all this digital technology and digital equipment allows us to do is, I think Peter was indicating, get back as close as possible to the original source material. We can get so much closer now than would have been possible 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. So we're able to start almost at the same place that Curtis did and then work from there. And again, that's one of the really fun things about the project, is we get to start with something and say, how do we reinterpret it in a way, again, that honors what he did, but make it even hopefully more interesting for a lot of people. And I think Chris is going to give us the hook in just a second, but let's answer 2 more questions.
Quick question. Did you have access to any glass plates or negatives?
Yes, almost all of Curtis's negatives have been lost or destroyed. The family just donated 600 or 700 to the Smithsonian about 2 years ago. There are a few more scattered around, and I was lucky enough to get a small archive of 64 or 5 negatives almost 20 years ago, and that's actually the reason we formed the company and Peter came on board, was to work with those negatives and create the gold tones. Todd?
You mentioned that Curtis and the Native American community were proprietors back then. How is the Native American community integrated with this project, or is there other projects within the Curtis genre that they are integrated?
Yeah, great question. So how are contemporary Native Americans relating to either what we're doing or Curtis's work? I'll take it a little broader in general. And it's been really interesting. As you saw from some of the quotes, I've had a number of really prominent Native American writers contribute to our work. Louise Erdrich, Eric Jolly, Scott Momaday. And I think what is happening more and more, we went through a period in the 70s when a white academic writer wanted to make a name for himself, apparently, from what he's even said himself, and wrote a very critical book saying, well, again, this was this white guy, he went in, he's appropriating their culture, he didn't really understand what was going on, these are poor victims, and he was exploiting them. So there was a certain amount of that went on for a while. And what has really been happening the last 10 to 20 years is that everybody is now realizing that's not true at all. Read the text, look at the photographs. You saw the kind of intimacy, openness, and connection that existed between Curtis and many of his subjects. That doesn't happen if you're exploiting a victim. Those were people who clearly wanted to be participating, and there's lots of written record. This is what they wanted left. There was certainly a possibility they would disappear as a people. There were still people advocating for the extinction of all native people on this continent in 1900. But certainly their culture was cultural genocide would be the nicest description I could think of to describe what was really going on then. So they wanted this record produced. And also it's been really interesting, I've heard from Native people about how respectful they are of Curtis because of the things he didn't photograph. There were certain things that were so sacred that he did not photograph them and did not record them. So I think it's really come around full circle. I'm working on a big project, as Chris mentioned. We've got 30 or 40 or 50 institutions in the Pacific Northwest. We're going to be taking it national and international for the celebration of Curtis's birth. And I'm happy to say in our little 8-person steering committee, we have a tribal chief who's also the head of an affiliated group of tribes. He's trying to bring other tribal groups, and that's certainly a very important part of everything we're trying to do. As I said, we're working on some major repatriation projects with imagery, language, culture, and individual names. Okay, Chris, you got the shepherd's hook out?
I'm sure we could be here all evening, but Chris has books for sale out in the hall and out in the atrium, and I suspect he'd even sign them for you. We have refreshments if you'll stay around, and I'm sure Peter and Chris and Chip will be happy to answer more questions. So let no detail go unnoticed, and let's thank our speakers one more time.